Welcome to episode 197 of the Lucretius Today Podcast. Today we are very privileged to bring to you an interview with Dr. Marcelo Boeri, professor of ancient philosophy at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. Dr. Boeri is originally from Buenos Aires, Argentina, and after receiving his Ph.D. from the University of Salvador in 1995, he has worked extensively in the field of ancient Greek philosophy ever since, lecturing at many distinguished universities around the world. We are greatly appreciative of Dr. Boeri taking the time to talk with us today about his excellent new book, co-written with Javier Aoiz, entitled Theory and Practice in Epicurean Political Philosophy, Security, Justice, and Tranquility. This book is an excellent addition to the field of Epicurean studies, and I want to encourage everyone who has any interest in Epicurus' views to be sure to check out this extensively researched and very well-argued book. Thank you for your time today, Dr. Boeri. Many readers of Epicurus get the impression that right up there with things like don't worry about gods and don't worry about death, that Epicurus is also focused on saying live unknown and stay completely out of politics. And it's going to come as a surprise to many who read your book that your position is that that is not true. And so there's an incorrect view out there about what Epicurus thought about what we can call social engagement, maybe. You can call it politics, you can call it a lot of things, but social engagement seems to be a pretty good term. So there's an incorrect view out there. And what we'd like to talk with you about is what is that incorrect view? How did we get to the point where that incorrect view became so dominant? And then what did Epicurus really teach about justice and engagement with society? So let's start with a view about living unknown and staying completely out of politics. It seems that it's a real theme of your book that that's not what Epicurus's position really was.
Okay, well, I will try to formulate this more or less clearly in English or something near enough. First of all, what you have to take into consideration is the fact that these injunctions, live unnoticed or live unknown or do not participate in politics, is part of what we call the indirect tradition. The indirect tradition says not what Epicurus or the Epicureans say, right? That's the first point, and it's a very important point in our view. These slogans, that's the reason why many people, many scholars during the last maybe 10 years or more than that, used to say that these are cliches, some sort of slogans to try to characterize the way in which Epicurus and the Epicureans present the social or political philosophy. But if you examine the various passages that we receive from antiquity, which were attributed to Epicurus himself and to some Epicureans, you cannot find that slogans or that sayings formulated in that way. That's a first point. And in our view, with my colleague and co-author Javier Aoiz, that's a very important point, because if that slogans are not true, you cannot explain the way in which Epicurus himself is strongly engaged with his city in terms of the use he does of the laws concerning testaments or things like that. So that's the first point. On the other side, according to Epicurus, living pleasurably doesn't only imply the fact of enjoying sensual pleasures in the most strong sense you can imagine, because the pleasant life, the Epicurean pleasant life, implies also living prudently and justly. Epicurus says, phronimos kai dikaios. These are very, very strong words. This is said explicitly by Epicurus in the Key Doctrine 5, in the letter to Meneceus 1:32, and other places in the passages that were received from antiquity that were attributed to Epicurus himself, right? On the other side, the interaction of Epicurus with Athens and the interaction of the Epicureans in the communities, in the political communities in general, were very strong, and they were not limited to actions dictated, let's say, by the living prudently and justly. This interaction was always framed by the activity of living honorably. Epicurus says kalos is an adverbial expression. In ancient Greek, to kalon literally means the beautiful, what is fine, or what is noble, not only in an aesthetical sense, but also in a moral sense, right? And that's a way of life that the Epicurean doctrine recommended through friendship and philanthropy as well. So this is not a minor point, according to many people and according to us as well. In our book, we try to show an image of the interactions of Epicurus and the Epicureans with their political communities. We try to show that that interactions were more complex and varied and interesting with the anti-Epicurean tradition, which is still very strong. That's a second very important point in our view. You could object that Epicurus himself sometimes recommends to leave aside the prison, Epicurus says, of the general or conventional education and politics. He says that in the Vatican Sentence 58. But we argue that the proper reading of this kind of suggestions, or the slogans like do not participate in politics or leave unnoticed or unknown, is mainly focused on the fact that Epicurus recommends that you must not be involved in contingent politics, because contingent politics involves or can produce desires and anxieties that you cannot control. And that can be very disturbing for your practical life, right? That's another very important point in our view.
Dr. Boeri, could you explain what contingent politics means? I'm not sure that all of our listeners will be familiar with that term.
Well, the everyday life, the everyday life politics, the real politics in terms of what happens in terms of elections or the struggles you have with the person who thinks exactly the opposite of what you think in everyday politics. That's what I call contingent politics, right? The everyday life in politics. It's more or less obvious that why Epicurus and the Epicureans, in our view, is very obvious, recommended do not participate in politics in that sense of what politics can be understood. And the way in which they perform their political practices surely do not contribute to the ataraxia, the tranquility, and the absence of pain. So, which ataraxia, tranquility, and what they call aponia, absence of pain, both in a physical and a psychological sense. These are the two main stable pleasures. And what this shows is that the way in which they understood the notion of hedone, pleasure, was very sophisticated and was not reduced to the satisfaction of your essential desires, right? Okay, this is my answer to your first question.
Okay.
I don't know if that is enough. Of course, you need to argue this in very detail, and that's what we tried to do in our book, of course. But it's mainly our point. To sum up what I have said, these are part of the cliches that were imposed since antiquity. Do not participate in politics. Our point is that both Epicurus and the Epicureans participated in politics in terms of the practical use they made of the political institutions of the cities where they were living, right? They respected the formal laws of the cities where they were living. They used the laws concerning testaments and that kind of things. And even more, they were, especially the Epicureans, for example, Philodemus and many other people after Philodemus, they were priests, they were advisors, so they were very near the political power. And that was a way of participating in contingent politics in a way, but not directly anyway, right? Okay.
Right. Fernando.
Yes, well, as first a comment, I want to extend a congratulations to you, Marcelo, and to Javier, because it's a very clear book. It's very well documented. And I like very much how you argue along these chapters. I see why you called in the book Theory of and Practice of Epicurean Political Philosophy.
Right.
Because we can see clearly that in the first chapters, we have the theory. And in the last chapter, for example, you describe the actual behavior of real Epicureans. And you describe how they were involved in politics, not because they were looking for power or get more richer, but because they want to serve to the community and to get security for their Epicurean life. So it is a great picture that you draw in this book that permits us as readers to see why Epicurus was so respected by other philosophers and by the people who lived in Athens with him. So congratulations for the book. And I think this book will be very important for the Epicurean studies, especially
Thank you so much.
in
Very
politics.
kind.
And I also like that how you frame the Epicurean philosophy in ancient discussions, because Epicurus was responded to the questions that the tradition had. And also that you try to nuance the Epicurean position. For example, this question of egoism and altruism, why Epicurean recommendation to not involve in politics. It doesn't mean that we'll hide or anything like that. It only implies that we will involve in politics insofar we can have a pleasurable life, and that Plutarch's interpretation, for example, as you said, is mischievous, is virulent, and it's not very just with him. So I wanted to highlight those things from your book, and thank you for being here in the conversation.
You mentioned Plutarch. Well, Plutarch is a very important author. The problem with Plutarch is that he is an extremely hostile author. He's very hostile not only with the Epicurus and the Epicureans, but also with the Stoics. Plutarch was ideologically, doctrinally, in philosophical terms, Plutarch was a Platonist. Right? So he has, of course, his own agenda. Plutarch is a Platonist, so he believes very strongly the ABC of Plato's ontology. The real things are immaterial things. Epicurus and the Epicureans were mainly materialists. The soul or your mind is a body, is a very subtle body, but it's a body. And of course, these are not minor details. But in addition to that, what is interesting in the case of Plutarch is that, of course, we have some evidence that he had some texts written by Epicurus himself and by other Epicureans probably too. And he provides a very biased testimony of what the Epicurean doctrine was. For instance, Plutarch, also Cicero, both Plutarch and Cicero, both of them are very hostile sources for the reconstruction of the Epicurean theory, but for the most part, they avoid talking about the issue of security, friendship, or philanthropy. Three issues that are very, very important for social Epicurean philosophy or political Epicurean philosophy, if we can talk in these terms. And it's interesting because you can contrast Epicurus texts you have with some passages in different books by Plutarch. And it's very impressive sometimes to know that Plutarch must have read something very similar we have, but he omits very crucially some details that can be very important to prove that what Plutarch is saying is false, or that he is providing a very biased reading of the whole argument, insofar as you can reconstruct the whole argument, of course. So that's a very interesting point, but it's very remarkable, the fact that both Cicero and Plutarch always minimize the issue of friendship, philanthropy, which are very basic and important themes in the political, ethical, and in general social Epicurean philosophy. That's very impressive, very impressive. When you are studying the text, you know that, and that's very obvious in my view, after many years of reading Plutarch and Epicurus and many other sources which are more or less important to try to reconstruct Epicurus' political or ethical philosophy, The case of Epictetus is very important too. Epictetus was very hostile to Epicurus and the Epicureans as well. Well, we know that between the Epicureans and the Stoics, there were a real struggle. They share some issues. Both Epicurus and the Stoics were materialists in ontological terms, but they have enormous differences between them as well. But, well, the problem we have is that the textual evidence we have for reconstruction of Epicurus doctrines is very, very scanty, and eventually we depend on what Plutarch, Cicero, and other sources. Sources belonging to what we call the indirect tradition. Leave a Notice is the title of one of the treatises by Plutarch, for example, right? And the way in which Plutarch explains that idea is very limited in many senses. Okay.
Dr. Boeri, I think you wrote an article with a title something like Cicero's Clamorous Silences.
Yes, right.
And the point you're making there is that in the principal doctrines and in the documents we do have from Epicurus, there's a great deal of discussion of justice and security and principles that go along with that. And yet Cicero and Plutarch and these other hostile writers largely ignore those points, and they do not discuss them.
Right. It's interesting. The case of Cicero is particularly remarkable because, he was educated by a couple of Epicurean masters, especially by Phaedrus. And we have some evidence coming from Cicero himself in the second book of the Finibus, that's titled in Latin. It's very impressive the fact that Cicero read the whole key doctrines, the Kyriae Doxae, that's the name of that group of sentences written by Epicurus himself. And it's very impressive the way in which Cicero is making a very selective use of key doctrines. And he usually avoids to comment on those doctrines or key doctrines where Epicurus talks about asphaleia, security, which is directly connected with the issue of friendship and even with the issue of philanthropy. The idea that your political community, the polis, the city where you live, can provide some security in more or less formal terms because of the laws that regulate, that rule the activities among the human beings living there, of course. And well, Cicero and also Plutarch, they try to say that Epicureans absolutely reject the formal laws of the polis, so it's not clear what they are talking about. Well, they are talking about that there is a way in which you can live in a civilized way in the polis where you're living, respecting those laws, making use of these laws. That's a very important point. We have some evidence, some clear evidence that Epicurus and the Epicureans were making use of the formal laws of the cities where they were living. But in addition to that, Epicurus and the Epicureans, that's the way in which formally the city where you live can provide some security. But it's interesting because Epicurus talks about something that he calls the purest asphaleia, the purest security. This is in the Key Doctrine 14, a very, very important passage, because the purest security is in your own tranquility, in the way in which you can deal with the desires you have, the way in which you can learn to desire what you can desire because you can satisfy what we are desiring, right? So if you read that passage and many other passages that say something similar in Epicurus and Epicurus, and compare that passage with the situation of the polis where you are living, I mean, if you compare that passages with the way in which you can say that the political community where you live can provide you some security in legal terms, it's a fantastic combination in a sense, because Epicurus says, well, the formal laws are very important, but they are not enough. You have to work in your own peace of mind, trying to learn what you have desired because of the fact that you are a human being. So we are a very limited creature. And that's a very important point for Epicurus, because one of the most basic and powerful, in my view, suggestions in Epicurean times is what you have to do to try to remove fear, phobos, Epicurus says. And there are many passages, for example, in Lucretius, the Roman Epicurean, Of course, it's not the same, exactly the same thing as Epicurus, but Lucretius wrote a very important text, and we have the whole text. And Lucretius suggests that if war, I'm paraphrasing the passage I have, if war, especially civil war, is one of the most important threats for the security of your polis, the plague is not the less important threat for your life. And so Lucretius says, well, your polis can provide you social and political security, but you have to learn to live without fear in your life. So you need to make a very personal, interior work, and you can do that sharing your life with other people who think something similar. This is the community of Epicurean friends, but our point with Javier Aoiz in our book was that this is not only a very small community of Epicurean friends. This is something that you can extend to the rest of the people in the polis where you are living as a citizen. And this is more or less clear in the sense in which the Epicurus and the Epicureans talk about philanthropy. So the sense that these premises to try to organize and to order your personal life can be extended to the rest of humanity. Okay.
Yes, one of the things that strikes me when I was reading the book is that you show that there are a lot of evidence that Epicurus and the Epicureans had a social political thought. You mentioned Marcus in Porphyry, Lucretius in On the Nature of Things, Book 5, and the Principal Doctrines. And when I see that, it's hard for me to understand why contemporary readings of Epicurus think that he was a politic in one sense. We have all this evidence, but we also have this interpretation, these slogans of not involved in politics and basically hide in your community of friends. But when you say this, I imagine that there was a project in political philosophy of extending these principles in the society and extending. We know that Epicurus had this project of extend his philosophy thanks to the letters and thanks to the portraits that Epicurus had and in the statues that he had in Athens. So the picture that you deploy of Epicurus is a more gentle man that was respected in the city, and the Roman Epicureans and the Athenian Epicureans, it was the same, that they were convinced that this security, not only, as you say, not only in terms of much of resources, but also in the mind, being free for fears and trying to live a pleasant life.
You have to think that when Epicurus arrived in Athens, both the academy, the Platonic Academy and the Lyceum, were very, very active. There were many people there discussing philosophy. I mean, people discussing philosophy within the intellectual context, groups of people. One always have to recall the fact that in antiquity, there were few people who were able to read and write. So I'm not suggesting that all the people in the street were talking about Epicurean atomism or Epicurean political or ethical philosophy. No, I don't think that was the case. But it's important to recall this fact that when Epicurus started doing philosophy, well, both the Academy and the Lyceum were very active. So Epicurus, coming from the island of Samos, he was an Athenian citizen anyway, but he's arriving from the island of Samos, and he started talking about things ontological and ethical and political terms. It was a little weird for a Platonic mentality, if I can say that. And that's one of the reasons why you can understand the strong discussions that started there. And I think that the other point that we eventually should take into consideration is the fact that probably the Epicurean philosophy was accepted by many people. And, well, there were some struggles because of political or even economical interests.
Dr. Boeri, we have a couple of very specific questions, but before we get into more specifics, if we could stay at the general level for just a moment more, because our listeners are probably interested in this. If living unknown and staying out of politics is an incorrect summary of Epicurus's views, how would you summarize the correct view? we don't want to reduce everything to a slogan, and we can't do that.
Okay.
But in general, what do you think Epicurus would have suggested to his people in regard to politics and engagement with society?
Okay, that's the first question, right? I would summarize that as saying what I have already said in part, at least. The sense of do not participate in politics and live unknown should be understood in the sense in which you can get correct balance between political formal security that can be provided by the polis where you live as a citizen on the one hand, and the efforts you have to make to try to be a good Epicurean agent, to try to neutralize fear, to try to get tranquility, peace of mind, and how you can combine these two factors that can go together without problem at all for an Epicurean philosopher who is not only interested in providing some theoretical arguments to try to explain the reality as a whole, but is also interested in living according to those principles. So I would summarize in that way. If I could speak in my mother tongue, I could say that more properly, probably. But I think that you can reconstruct in a very reasonable way these two aspects of human life. So the way in which you live in a political, social context where there are more or less clear laws regulating the life of the citizens. And on the other hand, but not independently of the life you have to live within a social community, the work you have to with yourself as a rational agent to try to neutralize fear is a very important notion also in the Epicurean agenda. The idea is that you have to try to remove fear. For instance, the fear you can have regarding the gods. There is not good reason, according to Epicurus, that you have to think that God is an entity, especially worried about complicating your life and things like that. No, of course not, according to Epicurus. And Epicurus never says explicitly that he doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe in the common gods. So gods having human affections, emotions. No, that's not true, according to Epicurus. There is a couple of lines, maybe 5 lines in the letter to Meneceus, where Epicurus says, no, that's just a belief, a hypolepsis, he says. This is a kind of statement that can be either true or false, but according to the prolepsis, the preconception we have of what God is, you cannot expect that God is concerned with ruining your life. That's absolutely rational for Epicurus and the Epicureans. And that's part of the work you have to do with yourself, within the Epicurean community, with your friends, to try to remove fear in your everyday life, right? And again, I think that there is good reason to think that the Epicureans were worried about the fact that that work is not limited to the small group of Epicurean friends. That's the sense in which the cover of our book tried to show, because if you can see there, this is the Acropolis. These are supposed to be, according to myself, of course, the Epicurean group of friends, but the Epicurean group of friends are talking and living their lives with a certain projection to the polis of Athens, where Epicurus lived for the most part his life as an active philosopher, right? So that would be my answer.
Okay, and this is the point to ask you, are there examples of Epicurean historical figures you can cite for us? I think you did a number of them in the book, but are there particularly good examples of Epicurean historical figures who were properly applying the balance that you're talking about between engagement and non-engagement?
Oh, yes. Philodemus is a very good example. Unfortunately, Philodemus' texts are fragmentary, but he wrote a very important book, title in English, I think, is On the Management of Your Property, or something like that. The title itself shows that Philodemus, in a very Epicurean sense, thinks that your property, and property there is your private property, of course, is very important for having a rational life within a polis. And we have some fragments coming from that book that in part show it's a fragmentary literature. It's very, very complicated. It's very difficult. But we have some passages from that book showing that he was thinking in a very strong Epicurean terms is very important. It's crucial, actually, the way in which you can work on yourself or being a rational Epicurean agent. Tranquility, removing fear or security all the time in the group of your Epicurean or eventually not Epicurean friends, etc. But it's important to deal with all these important issues belonging to Epicurean philosophy within a polis, not living in an island. No. It's very clear that Philodemus think that this combination is what you have to do in your life, or having a rational life in Epicurean terms.
And in addition to Philodemus, I think you mentioned several Epicureans who were advisors to kings or participated in directly.
Yes, there are many names.
You mentioned also Atticus, Titus, Pomponius Atticus.
There are many names. I think that Philodemus is a very interesting example because he was formerly an Epicurean. Metrodorus is another good example. We have some fragments coming from the books he wrote.
You mentioned also Diogenes of Enoanda.
Lucius Alphaeus, and this is another very important person in political terms who endorsed Epicurean philosophy.
I think, Fernando, we turn to some of the specific questions. One of the themes in the book that you talk about is under the theory of genealogy of justice. The book compares the parallels between how justice arose and also how language arose, sort of naturally and specifically among the particular people who were involved, and not handed down by God or handed down by some kind of Platonic form. You analogize the emergence of justice with the emergence of language. Is that something you could tell us just a little bit about?
Well, probably the most important source you have to understand that is Lucretius, Book 5 especially, and some passages in Book 6 on the nature of things. That's the title in English, I think, of the Rerum Natura, Lucretius says in his Latin. Yes, language is very important because the origin of language, the account he provides to explain the way in which language arises, is very complex. I can say some general things right now. Language is very important because it explains in part the origin of what Epicurus and the Epicureans call prolepsis. Prolepsis is a very important notion. I know you can say prolepsis in English. We usually translate preconception, which can be a very complicated term because Epicurus is a very empiricist philosopher. Also, Epicurean epistemology is strongly empiricist. So what's the sense of in preconception? Because it can evoke some form of ignitism. But that's not the case in the case of Epicurus. There is a very interesting explanation of the way in which Epicurus think about this point in the Book 10 of Diogenes Laertius, when he explains the origin of language in Epicurus in terms of what I would like to call, I'm not sure that my friend and colleague Javier Aoiz, my co-author, shares all the points of what I'm going to say in a second, what I would like to call the ostensive way of acquiring language, because Epicurus provides a couple of examples. For example, when you are a very little boy or girl and your mother says, hey, horse. That's the example apparently Epicurus gave. Horse. That's the way in which I talk about an ostensive way of acquiring language. So after a couple of times, when someone says to you, that's a horse, you identify that sound, that utterance, with a certain specific kind of thing of your empirical world, right? So this is the way in which Epicurus, your soul is affective, and you receive an imprint in your soul or your mind of that sound, which is associated with a certain kind of thing in the perceptible world. That's very important for Lucretius because he says that the origin of language, if what starts ordering, so to speak, the human relations, when we pass from the totally natural and savage, in a sense, ways of relationship to start ordering ourselves. And he describes that in genealogical terms, if we can say this, showing that there were an age in humanity when everything was very confused and nobody respected anything. And there is a certain moment in which there is some, I don't know how to say this in English, ablandamiento, softening or something like that among human beings, and language contributes a lot from that softening among human beings. And one can say, well, that's a horse, that's mine, that's justice, that's etc. Of course, this is a very complicated issue because it's not the same thing to talk about the horse and to talk about justice. Horse is a purely descriptive or theoretical notion, and justice is what we call evaluative or practical concept. This is a discussion that was present already in Plato, for example, the difference between these kinds of concepts. But you can see that the detail of this passage from the totally savage life to a more or less civilized at the very beginning of human life to a complete civilized life, especially in Book 5 of Lucretius' work. And the language plays a very, very important role because it's the way in which you can start categorizing the different things in the world, not only perceptible things such as a horse, but also things such as justice, which is supposed to be one of the most important examples given by Epicurus himself of what the prolepsis is. He talks about the prolepsis of justice, the prolepsis of God, the prolepsis, etc. We are working right now with my colleague on a paper dealing with the connections between prolepsis and the origin of language in the terms I try to describe in a very, very general way.
Dr. Boeri, in the book, you say that the justice for Epicurus is not conventional, it's relative. We would like you to tell us more about this.
Yes, it's relative. There is a certain relativism that you can attribute to the Epicurean notion of justice, but not relativism in the sense in which you can say that the sophists in general, according to our argument, I'm sorry to refer to our argument, but we're talking about what we would try to argue in our book. But according to us, the notion of justice in Epicurus and in general terms in Epicureanism, there are some lines in the fragments we have from Philodemus' book that explain this point in this way. According to Epicurus and the Epicureans, justice is a certain utility, is what we call the modality of utility. Is a way in which you can use utility according to the present circumstances. They don't talk about justice in absolute terms. Epicurus says a little violently, you have to say, spit on the beautiful itself. It's insulting Plato and Platonists. So what I'm trying to say is that Epicurus does not take justice to be a Platonic form. Is something that you can use and adapt to the present circumstances you are living. That does not mean that is an absolute relativism in the sense in which you can attribute this notion to Protagoras, for example, the sophist Protagoras, according to a very debatable interpretation of what Protagoras' relativism was. What Epicurus seemed to have thought is that you had to be able, as the rational being you are, to adapt what is just to the present circumstances. We provide an example. It's not an Epicurean or an Epicurus example in our book, but think about what happened in a situation like when the harvest is not very good, for instance, and the productions of food are very scanty because it wasn't a good year, for example. Well, an Epicurean would say, well, we have to share food in equal parts because that's very convenient for the survivance of our social or political community. We have not a lot of food, but we have to share justly what we have. But this is not something that is fixed for secula secularum. No, this can vary because the next year the harvest can be much better. So the way in which you use justice according to the present circumstances today cannot match with the way in which that circumstances indicate that must be employed the notion of justice according to these circumstances that can vary and be different from what the circumstances you are living right now. That's the way in which we understand the Epicurean concept of justice as a modulation, we say, of utility. The notion of utility is not utility in an extremely utilitarian sense of what is convenient for myself in egoistic terms. No, it's what is convenient for the community as a whole. This is very useful for the community because what we want, according to the Epicureans, is to preserve the social community, the only place in which you can live as a human being for an Epicurean.
Dr. Boeri, as we begin to close, I suspect that there's one question that all of our listeners would be particularly interested in hearing you talk about. We stay away on our forum and our discussions from partisan politics, but everybody has sort of an interest in terms of, well, what kind of a system of government would Epicurus really have preferred? Was he a Democrat? Was he a monarchist? Was he a...
That's an excellent question. And probably I don't have the correct answer. It's a very good question. Actually, I don't know. We can try to answer that question together. It's because it's very complicated. And it's interesting to know that in the texts attributed to Epicurus and some important Epicureans, we don't have clear indications in that way.
Is it purely contextual, do you think, in terms of depending on the situation at a particular time, he might endorse one form of government as against another, just depending on the conditions at that particular moment? And could it, in fact, change over time with conditions? Just like he talks about justice changing.
Probably. That's a good idea. Yes, to be totally honest, I don't know. Because the point is that, well, monarchy, who knows? But it should be an Epicurean monarch, right? That's the reason why the realpolitik of the age of that time would not allow the Epicureans to propose an Epicurean monarch, right?
A lot of considerations involved there, but we can leave it at least at this point that you don't see a very clear answer to the question that he always would have preferred monarchy or he always would have preferred democracy or some other form.
There are some suggestions in different texts, I think in the direction of a monarchy, but can be very, very complicated to try to start an Epicurean monarchy for very obvious reasons, in my view. Yes, you should write the next book on Epicurean political philosophy, trying to answer that question. No, there are some textual evidence about that, but it's not clear at all, in my view.
You have people, when they talk about Cassius Longinus, who you mention in your book, yes. You'll have people say, well, Cassius was not a good Epicurean because he was so closely involved in those political events. And yet he was talking to Cicero about Epicurean philosophy at the very time that they were revolting against Julius Caesar.
Yes, well, Caesar was writing about Epicurean philosophy, but he was very hostile with the Epicureans all the time. There is a very interesting passage, I think, in the second book of On Moral Ends, where Caesar says, well, I'm not attacking the persons, the Epicurean persons, I'm just attacking the doctrines. I don't believe it, because he's a very unjust person, very biased, his testimony about Epicurus. And what is very, very obvious in our view, in that paper you mentioned, thank you for mentioning that paper, Cicero's silence is very clamorous in our view, because it's very, very evident. It's evident that he was reading the Epicurean texts that we have, and he omitted them consciously. So, but yes, you're right. It's interesting, the impact that the Epicurean philosophy had in the political and higher classes in Rome, for example. That's very impressive. They were advisors, people, always near the power, the Epicureans. You have to remember that. Always near the power. No, well, an Epicurean can say, no, I'm just an advisor, I'm just a priest. No, but being a priest was a very important position in that age. So leave a notice, do not participate in politics. Well, that's a way of participating in politics, of course. But Cicero is a very, very difficult case. We own a lot, Cicero, but you have to read him very cautiously. It's very complicated because he knows everything, Cicero. You have to remember that Cicero not only was able to read Greek, he was able to speak in Greek as well. He was an educated person, and in antiquity, your second language was Greek. Cicero invented a number of terms that we still use in philosophy. For instance, enunciation. perception. That's a word invented by Cicero. He says perceptio, where perceptio is not just perceptible perception, but also intellectual perception in the sense of understanding, of course. So he was a very well-educated person, and he was a very smart guy. But he was a professional politician as well, narrator, and he was very near Plato and Platonism. He says that Plato was the principal, the king of philosophers in antiquity. He says that a couple of times. Well, it's good. You have the right to be a Platonist, of course. I like a lot Plato, and I have studied a lot of Plato and Platonism. But of course, if you have a Platonist agenda, well, you have good reasons to be attacking almost all the time what Epicurus and the Epicurean says. Because, for instance, another detail which is very interesting in Cicero is the way in which he explains or tried to explain Epicurus' hedonism. Because Cicero is absolutely aware of the fact that Epicurus' hedonism is not just sensual hedonism. Cicero is aware that Epicurus' hedonism is a very sophisticated kind of hedonism. Because absence of pain and tranquility is not just the pleasure you can feel when you are eating your pizza and drinking your beer. Of course not. That's very important for Epicurus as well as a necessary condition for getting tranquility. We are human beings, we are sensible beings, we have certain needs that must be satisfied, of course. We need to drink and to eat. Eventually we have sexual desires, etc. These are natural desires and a good desire. The point for Epicurus is that your own life, your personal life, is just anchored in sensual desires or sensual pleasures. That's not the way in which you have to direct your life. But of course, you have to satisfy your desire for eating and drinking and eventual sexual desires, of course.
And Cicero knows that, but he just doesn't explain
very
it.
Very well. But he accused Epicurus and the Epicureans, well, these beasts that thinks that life is just a sensual pleasure. No, man, what are you talking about? That's not present in Epicurus or Epicureans.
Thank you for your time today. Thank you, Fernando. I really want to thank Dr. Boeri, and hopefully at some point we may be able to have his co-author on as another interview at another time. But Dr. Boeri graciously made himself available to us, and we really appreciate his time and his participation in the interview today.
Well, thank you so much for the interview, for your interest in our work. So a last advice I can give you, leave a notice, but not in the sense that Plutarch says.
Very good. Well, having listened to this interview today, I think people will have a much better understanding of Epicurus' true position on that. So,
okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.